Hello everyone and welcome back. So today we're going to be looking into client-side validation using JavaScript. So client-side validation is really useful for giving quick feedback to the user and also potentially reducing the amount of requests that your API will get, for example, on like let's say you've got a contact form that posts to /contacts. If you have client-side validation, it will be a kind of extra step that will ensure that when a user submits to that endpoint, they're actually including everything you need and in the format that you need it. Now, unfortunately, because on the client side, a user can technically edit the code, they can go in and edit the JavaScript, you can't rely on it fully, which means you still need server-side validation as well. Now, the good thing about what we're going to be building in this video is that it also works well with server-side validation. So it doesn't validate on the server side, but it does. When you return the errors, we can display the errors using the code we're going to be writing. So it's really useful for doing client-side validation and showing the user the errors from the client-side validation stuff, but also showing errors from server-side validation. So it serves two purposes, really easy, and well, let's just get into it. So the first thing we want to do is add some HTML5. You actually need, I should start off by saying you need two files. You need an index.html file and a main.js file. So I don't want to take up too much of your time by showing you all the HTML stuff. So what I'm going to do is kind of paste in some stuff. Client-side validation. I'm just going to add the title here. I'm going to paste in some stuff and then kind of go through what you need to know, and then we'll write out all the JavaScript ourselves, because I think that's the most important part. So if I'm going to ruin some of the magic here. So I have written a HTML file beforehand. So I'm just going to add class p4, and I'm using Tailwind for this actually, so I need to pull that in first of all. So we'll add this script at the top, which just pulls in the CDN for Tailwind. It doesn't really matter what you use. You can use whatever, if you're using Bootstrap or Material or just plain CSS. I actually forgot. I forgot what CSS was called then for a second. Yeah, if you're using plain CSS, that's completely fine. The design of this doesn't really matter. All we want to do is make sure that we show the errors. How you design it is completely up to you, which is why I'm not really going to be taking too much time up, writing JavaScript. So the first thing we need, we will be writing JavaScript, writing HTML. I don't want to be taking up too much time with HTML. So the first thing we need is a form, and we need an ID. So we'll do my-form, and obviously you can call it whatever you want. Something to note here: if you do want to do a traditional form submit, first of all, this code, if you do a traditional form submit where you actually when you click submit and it kind of submits the page, if that makes sense. The server-side part of this code won't work, so the stuff that shows the server-side errors, because you'll end up getting redirected to the posting the form page. That makes sense if you're doing a traditional, like if you're doing contacts. So if we do method post and then action, not accept, action /contacts, something like that, contacts, then it'll post to /contacts. So the part of our code that shows the response from the server won't work, because you'll effectively be on a different page, if that makes sense. It'll be posting to the /contacts page. So just bear that in mind. So the client-side validation is fine, but if you do a traditional form submit, then that part of the code, you won't actually end up writing it. So it's not like you're wasting any time. But yeah, that part of it won't work. But if you're using Ajax, which is what I'm going to be doing, and it's what I'd kind of recommend you do because it works well with the server-side validation stuff, then you can just add an ID and you're all good to go. So the next thing we're going to do is pull in the inputs. So if I just grab this div here, and I'll explain it to you. So this div here is literally just a container for the input, and all it does is add a margin to the bottom of it. So like if we have multiple inputs, each input will be wrapped in this div individually, so they'll all get this div MB4, and that will literally just add some space between the inputs just to make it look a little bit nicer. Like I said, design is completely up to you, so you can do what you want there. I've just got a label for the title as well, and the two things that really matter here, so this is where you need to pay attention. is the input, and it's got an ID. So this is really important because we can grab the value from JavaScript using this ID. Name's not as important, but it's still good to include it. This will be important if you're doing a form submit, a traditional form submit. So if you're doing like method post, then you'll need name there because that's how you get the value on the server side using the name. And then obviously we've got classes here, so you don't need to worry too much about these. And then we've got a label below the input, and this is the error. So you'll notice the ID here it begins with the ID of this input and then underscore error. So that's kind of the naming convention. Every input will have a corresponding label, and the corresponding label will begin with the ID from the input it relates to, and then it'll have underscore error. So this is how we'll get it, and it'll make a lot more sense when we write the JavaScript, but we're effectively, at some point in time, we are going to go through and look for each label with underscore error and blank them out when we reset the errors. And also when we want to add an error, we can just pass in the ID of this input, and we're able to get the label using that because we know that every single label has the ID underscore error. So we can get the corresponding label really easily. So that's pretty much it, and I think that'll all make a lot more sense when we actually write the JavaScript. So we've got this div here, that's just for the title. I need one more div just for the body of the to-do. That's what this form is doing, it's submitting a to-do. So we'll just copy this, and it's basically the same. Like I say, every one of these inputs has a div with a class of MB4, just to add some space. And then obviously we've got the label. In this case, it's a text area, so it works with other input types as well. We've got a text area, but it's still the same ID of body. And then the label you can see here is body, which is the ID here, underscore error. So the last thing we need is a button to actually submit the form. So we can add this in here. Like that. I think that's messed up the... There we go, that's fine. And then at the bottom of the body tag, we also need to bring in our script. There we go. So that's our HTML done. Quite easy. We've just got two inputs and this form, a submit button, and then obviously we're pulling in our JavaScript. Now what we can do is open that up in here. Let me just quickly go to code, and then I'll open it up here. There we go. So there's our input. It doesn't really do anything at the moment, but at some point it will. And you can see, whoops. So you can see what I meant about the submit thing. So when we click submit, it does kind of a form submit onto the page because we haven't specified an endpoint. So it just uses the page that it's on. So it's effectively submitting to this page, if that makes sense. So we've got title and body up here. What we're going to do is intercept that and stop it from doing it in the JavaScript. So we'll get on with writing that. So we'll go to main.js, and the first thing we need to do is pull in the form. So as I mentioned earlier, we need an ID on the form so that we can grab it in the JavaScript. So we've got this my form here. So we can do document.get element by ID, and ours is called my form. And once we've got that form, we can then add an event listener. Add event listener, and we'll be listening for the submit event. And when that event is called, we want to run handle submit. Now we haven't written this yet. This is going to be our custom function. But effectively why we're doing this is we want to intercept the submit function so that it runs our code instead of just submitting the form. And then we can do our validation before we submit the form. That's what that allows us to do. So we can add the functions in now and then kind of fill them in as we go along. So the first one is going to be the handle submit function. Now we'll do this at the end because it requires methods that we're going to be defining later on. So we'll just leave it blank for now, but it is actually going to take in a parameter, and we're just going to call it E, which is the event. So the next thing we need is show error. So we've got function show error, and this is going to take in an ID and a message. And what this is going to do is it's going to take in this ID and it's going to find the corresponding error label. So if we do const L, and that's going to be equal to document.get element by ID, and then we can use string interpolation, and we can just do ID underscore error. You can see how what I mentioned earlier about the error labels being named the way they are, the ID being the ID of the input, the ID of the input underscore error. So we can use it here. So we get the ID, which is going to be the ID of the input. And this will make sense later because we're going to call all this from other functions, right? So we're just kind of writing them out now. And then when we bring it all together, it'll make a lot more sense. But yeah, const L equals document.get element by ID, ID underscore error. And what we're going to do is add inner text. And the inner text is going to be equal to the message that we pass in. So this will be the error message. And then what we're going to do is get the class list. And then we're going to remove hidden. And what this will do, and I don't think I actually mentioned that, but you'll notice on these error labels we have hidden, and this effectively sets the display to none, I think. And what we want to do, and that's just because we don't want to show the error labels initially because there are no errors. So what we want to do, if there is an error, we want to set the error message and then remove hidden so that it shows the error label. So the next thing we need is a function called reset errors. And this is effectively going to go through all the error labels and just remove the error message. So sort of like what we do here, except to a blank string. And then we want to add errors. So it's kind of the opposite of show errors, but we want to do it for every single error label. So that makes things a little bit more tricky, but we can handle it. So we can do const errors equals document dot, and then we're going to use query selector all, because we want to get all the elements that match the query that we pass in. So what we can do is we can do a square bracket ID $sign equals, and then a single quote underscore error, a single quote, and then square bracket. And what this will do, and this is a bit of an odd one, and it's not something I use very often, to be honest with you, but what this is going to do is look for every element that has an ID, and then this $sign equals basically means contains underscore error. So again, you can see how this kind of naming convention is coming into play. So what that should do is it should find this label here because it's got an ID that's got underscore error in it, and then it should find this label here because, again, underscore error. And then what we're going to do is we're going to loop through each one. We can do error. We'll do error dot inner text equal to nothing, effectively. And then error dot class list dot add, and then we'll add hidden. So we will set the text to nothing, and then we will add hidden again to set display to none, and that should hide the errors. So the last thing we need is the validate form function. Now this function is an interesting one because it's going to be different for each of your forms, and it can be kind of as simple or complex as you want, because you're going to be validating the inputs, and obviously if you have certain inputs that need certain rules for your validation, then it could be as simple as just checking that there is something in the input, but then you could also do something like, oh, this input needs to have a maximum of 120 characters. So you could do a lot with this. We're going to keep it simple, but you could do a lot with this and make it as sort of complicated as you need. So we'll call it validate form. And the first thing we need to do is define a function called valid, and we'll set that to true. And this is what we're going to return at the end of the function. So effectively, at any point during this function, we could set this to false, and then we'll return it, and that means that the form isn't valid. So the first thing we'll do is test title. So we're going to be testing each input. Effectively, in our case, we're going to keep it simple and just check that the input actually exists. So we'll do const title equals document.getElementById title, and then we'll get the value. Oh, not that. Get the value. And then we'll do if there's no title, this is when we want to show an error. So we'll do show error. We'll pass in the ID, which will be title. And we'll say the message will be title is required. So the ID, so it'll use this ID here to get the error. So we can see show errors here. So it'll use this, then we'll pass it in here as the ID, and then we're doing document.getElementById title underscore error, which will be this label here, and then it'll pass in this message and set it here. So inner text will be equal to the message we pass in, and then we'll remove the hidden class. And then what we need to do is set valid to false, because we've encountered a validation error. We'll also do this same thing for body. So we'll do const body equals document.getElementById, do body, and then we'll just do body is required. I just noticed here I did double quotes. I'm mixing mixing and matching quotes here. So we'll change that to single quotes. It doesn't really matter, but we'll just keep consistency. So if there's no body, we're effectively just going to do the same thing. So show error, and we'll do body. Oh, you know what? I just realized I got so carried away. Right, so we just want to do document.getElementById body, and then we want to do the message here. So body is required. You know what it was? I was looking at this here, and I was like, oh yeah, I just need to write that out again. So I wrote it here instead. So show error, body is required, and and actually need to get the value here as well. Dot value, and then we need to put valid equals false. Now in this case, like if we fail up here, obviously valid will already be false when we get to this point, but there's no guarantee that this one will fail. So we need to, every time we do this, we need to set valid equal to false, because it might be true when we get to this point. So we just need to make sure that it is valid at the end if there is a validation error, effectively. And then we can return valid. So like I said, this one can be as complicated as you need it to be. So at the moment, we're just checking, if there's no title, then there's an error. But you could also do stuff like if title is less than 120 characters, maybe that's an issue. Maybe it needs to be more, something like that. Or maybe body has to be, more than 120 characters, or it can't be more than 120 characters, something like that. So you can really add what you want. You could do like email, and you could check if the input is a valid email or not. And if it's not a valid email, then you could do did a slash there. Then you could show an error, and you could pass an email and then say email is not valid, or something like that. Email is not a valid email, something along those lines. So like I say, you can do it as simply as as complicated as you need. And you might do really simple validation in here on the client side, but then do more complicated validation on the server side. Because this could just be client side. The way I view it anyway, the client side validation is just it's just kind of a little step you can do to make things a lot nicer for the user, and also take some strain off of your servers potentially. So you don't need to go crazy with the validation. You can just make sure all the inputs you need exist. And if they don't, you can show a nice error message to the user. So we'll do handle submit. This is going to be the last one we're going to do. So yeah, it's probably it's the longest one, but it's not too crazy. So we'll do e.prevent default. It's going to be the first thing. So prevent default, and this is what's going to stop the form from submitting, which is what it would normally do. The first thing we're going to run is reset errors. So reset errors. Obviously, grabs all of our error labels and then loops through them and basically just clears them and then hides them. So obviously the first time we submit the form, there aren't going to be any errors, so this reset errors is not really going to do a huge amount. But if, let's say, the user's submitted the form once and there's errors there, when they click submit again, we want to hide those errors to basically tell the user, you know, we're rechecking this form, and then the errors will reappear if, you know, if there are any errors. And it's just a nice thing for user experience because it lets the user know that something's happening. And it's also like, oh, you know, if you kept the errors there, then they might think that something's gone wrong. But if you remove the errors and then re-add them, if, you know, let's say they didn't fix any of the errors, if you re-add them, then it kind of tells them, oh, okay, I haven't fixed the issues. So yeah, it's just a nice thing for user experience, really. So now we're going to do an if, and inside of this if we'll do validate form. So it'll run validate form, and then the return value is going to determine whether we carry on with the if or not. So if it is valid, if by the end of this valid is true, then we can actually submit the form. Now, if you're doing the traditional form submit, like I mentioned, if you're doing, you know, the method equals post and action equals, you know, /contacts or whatever, then what you would do in this case is literally just do form.submit. I think that's right. Like that, something like that. And that would be fine, and you're basically done. And that's kind of what I was talking about, where it doesn't use the server-side stuff because you're submitting to an endpoint. So it's like doing the form submit to an endpoint. I don't really know how you phrase that, to be honest with you, but if you know what I mean, it kind of takes you, it does a post request to /contacts, so it kind of takes you off of the page. So our JavaScript stuff doesn't work. So yeah, that's really all I mean by that. So you can do the form submit and then it'll submit traditionally. However, if you're like me and you're wanting to do some Ajax stuff, then we can write out a fetch and kind of figure things out from there. So let's write const response equals await fetch, and that's why we made this function async. So the first thing we need to do is pass in our URL. So I do have a server running locally. I don't know if well, it basically it's this here. So it's localhost 8000 /todos. I can leave a link to the code in the description. It's one that I've already worked on. There's actually a video on this channel of building an API and then adding authentication to the API. So this is basically what this is. So I can leave a link in the description. So if you want to download it and run it, it's really simple. You can just pull it, do npm install, and then npm run dev, and you'll be able to follow along with this part a lot easier. So now we need an object, and inside of this object we can do method, and that's going to be equal to post. We need a body, and this is going to be json.stringify, and inside of here we can populate. Oh, I didn't mean to add a semicolon there. So we can do title, and then title is going to be document.get element by ID, and we'll do title and then get the value from that. And then we need body, and obviously it's going to be different for you depending on what you use, but on this to-dos endpoint it expects a title and a body. So we can do document.get element by ID body, and get the value of that. I keep adding semicolons where I'm not meant to do it. And then I'm going to do headers as well. So I'm going to do headers, and we'll do content type. So content dash type. Application / JSON semicolon, and then we'll do char set equal to UTF-8. All right, I put a 9 there. UTF-8. There we go. And that should be it for our fetch. So that's good. The next thing we want to do is check if the request was okay. So if response, and we're actually going to check if it's not okay, and then we're going to do the error logging, or the showing of the errors. So response.okay, if it's not okay, then what we want to do is get the errors from the response, so we can do const, and then we can use destructuring, I think it's called, errors, and that'll be equal to await response.json. And then what we want to do is, if there are errors, we want to loop through the errors and show them. So we do for, and then I'll show you in a second what the errors will look like from my API, and you can kind of adapt your code to suit the response that you're expecting. Because your API may return something different to mine, so I'll just show you what mine's going to return. So for const error in errors, and then we'll do show error. And then the first will be the error, which will be the ID. Effectively, it'll be the same ID as what is in our input. So like ID equals title. So the error, if we get the title wrong, if we forget the title, then error will be title. And then what we can do is use that to grab the message too. So over here is the errors that I'm expecting. So you can see here I'm passing in this errors object, and it's got a title, so it's got a key. In this case, it's title. So that's, if you do it properly, then it should be the same as what your input ID is. So let's go back here. In this case, title, and then title required. So that's the message. And then I've got body as well, and body required. So that's what will get returned if I miss out title and body. So yeah, loop through, and then show the error, title, and then this should get title required. So that's the error logging. After that point, you know that everything's gone right. If response is okay, it means that it was successful. So instead, what you can do here is just get the JSON, response.json. And then at this point, it's kind of up to you what you do. And obviously you can, do whatever with the JSON. And then at this point, it depends on your form. But what you could do is you can kind of blank out the form and then let the person resubmit it. So for example, if they're allowed to submit the form multiple times, then you could do that. Or you could add some kind of redirect. So I think in our case, what we'll do is just kind of blank out the form. So if you do document.get element by ID, and then we'll do title dot value value equal to nothing. And I'm just going to copy that. And we'll change that to body. And then we'll also do an alert to say to do created. There we go. So that should be about it. So we send the post request, we get the response back. If the response isn't okay, we try and get the errors from the JSON that gets returned, which is, in my case, this here. So we get errors. So we effectively end up with this object here that's got it's got a key value. The key is basically the ID of the input, and the value is the message that we want to show. So we use show error, pass in the ID of the input, and then pass in the message. And then, yep, I forgot that. Then we need to add a return, because what we don't want to do is we don't want to run the rest of this code. So we need to make sure that it returns. Then the user can, fix the errors and then resubmit, and then we go through the process again. So we've got this open already, so it should all be working. If we click submit, we can see it says title is required and body is required. So if we add in a title, then we should submit again, and we can see that the error is gone. So title is fine, no errors with that, but obviously body is required. But then if we add this in, we notice that we get another error. So our client-side error is gone, and now the error that we're seeing now is actually the server-side error. So on my API, I've made it so that the to-do body has to be more than 10 characters, or at least 10 characters. So if we just add more stuff in here, and then we submit, we get to-do created, so that's our alert, and then when we click OK, our form is now reset, ready for us to fail submit it again. So yeah, that's pretty much it. It's very straightforward. I think it's kind of a little bit hard to explain how we're doing it in regards to like the ID, you know, all these, the naming convention is a little hard to kind of explain, but hopefully that makes sense. You just need to make sure that your ID is then the same for everything else, so like ID underscore error effectively. And then, you know, your API should also return something like this. So it should return the ID, and then you can use that ID to get the error label and the input as well. So you know what error label to actually show the error under, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Hopefully you enjoyed. If it was helpful, leave a comment, let me know. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.